The icy wind whipped across the river's surface, sending ripples through the murky water as Daniel stood at its edge. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, a Christmas gift from Emily 2 years ago. The thought of her sent a fresh wave of pain through his chest, constricting his breathing. It had been exactly 1 year, 3 months, and 17 days since the accident that took her away from him forever. Daniel closed his eyes, allowing the bitter cold to numb his face. It was a welcome respite from the constant ache in his heart. The river had become his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the well-meaning but suffocating concern of his friends and family. Here, in the solitude of nature, he could scream his anguish into the void without judgment or pity. As he opened his eyes, Daniel's gaze fell upon the small town of Millbrook nestled on the opposite bank. The quaint New England architecture, once charming to his eyes, now seemed to mock him with its picturesque beauty. He and Emily had moved here 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of a quieter life away from the bustle of Boston. They had dreams of starting a family, of watching their children grow up in this idyllic setting. Now, those dreams lay shattered at his feet, as broken and lifeless as the twigs that littered the river bank. Daniel's mind wandered to the last conversation he had with his sister, Sarah, 2 weeks ago. She had called, her voice laced with worry, begging him to come stay with her in New York for a while. "You need to be around people, Danny," she had pleaded. "This isolation isn't healthy." But Daniel had refused, unable to bear the thought of leaving the house he and Emily had made their home. Every corner held a memory, every object a story. It was all he had left of her. As he stood there, lost in thought, a sudden movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another piece of driftwood carried along by the current. But as he focused, he realized there was something different about this particular chunk of debris. It seemed to be moving against the flow of the river, struggling to stay afloat. Curiosity piqued, Daniel took a few steps closer to the water's edge, squinting to get a better look. His heart nearly stopped when he realized what he was seeing. It wasn't driftwood at all, but a dog, a large, golden-furred animal thrashing weakly in the icy water. Even from this distance, he could see the panic in its eyes as it fought against the current. Without a second thought, Daniel plunged into the freezing river. The shock of the cold water hit him like 1,000 tiny knives, but he pushed through, his mind focused solely on reaching the struggling animal. As he swam closer, he could see that it wasn't just one dog, but 4, a mother Labrador retriever and 3 tiny puppies, all tied together with a cruel length of rope. The frigid water numbed his limbs, making each stroke a monumental effort. But something had awakened in Daniel, a fierce determination he hadn't felt in months. He reached the dogs just as they were about to go under, grabbing the rope with numb fingers and pulling them towards him. The mother dog whimpered softly, her eyes full of fear and exhaustion. The puppies were barely moving, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. Daniel's heart clenched at the sight, a surge of protective anger coursing through him. Who could do this to innocent animals? With the last of his strength, Daniel managed to drag himself and the dogs back to the shore. He collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for air, his body trembling from the cold and exertion. But there was no time to rest. The puppies were dangerously cold, their wet fur matted against their tiny bodies. Moving quickly, Daniel shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around the shivering animals. He gathered them in his arms, ignoring the biting cold against his wet clothes, and began the trek back to his house. Each step was a challenge, his waterlogged boots squelching in the mud, but he pressed on, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. As he walked, Daniel found himself talking to the dogs, words of comfort spilling from his lips. "It's okay, girl," he murmured to the mother dog, who was watching him with wary eyes. "You're safe now. I've got you." The simple act of speaking, of offering comfort to another living being, felt foreign after months of self-imposed silence. Yet, it also felt right, as if a long-dormant part of him was slowly coming back to life. By the time Daniel reached his house, a small Cape Cod-style home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, he was shivering violently. He fumbled with his keys, finally managing to unlock the door and stumble inside. The warmth of the house enveloped him, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Without hesitation, Daniel headed straight for the bathroom. He gently placed the bundle of dogs in the bathtub, then turned on the warm water, adjusting the temperature to make sure it wasn't too hot. As he began to carefully rinse the mud and river water from their fur, he noticed the rope around the mother dog's neck. It was tight, cutting into her skin, and Daniel felt a surge of anger at whoever had done this. "Hold on, girl," he murmured, reaching for a pair of scissors from the medicine cabinet. With utmost care, he cut away the rope, freeing the mother and her puppies. The Labrador looked at him with eyes full of gratitude, and for the first time in over a year, Daniel felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. As he dried off the dogs with soft towels, Daniel's mind raced. He needed to get them checked by a vet, but it was Sunday, and the local clinic would be closed. He'd have to wait until morning. For now, he focused on making them comfortable, creating a makeshift bed in the living room with old blankets and pillows. The puppies, now dry and warm, began to show signs of life. They whimpered and squirmed, nuzzling against their mother in search of milk. The sight brought a lump to Daniel's throat. It had been so long since he'd felt anything other than grief and anger, but watching these tiny creatures fight for life stirred something deep within him. As night fell, Daniel found himself sitting on the floor next to the dog's makeshift bed. The mother Labrador, whom he had started calling Maya in his head, rested her head on his lap, her eyes never leaving his face. One of the puppies, braver than the others, had crawled onto his leg and fallen asleep. For the first time in months, Daniel didn't feel the overwhelming urge to scream or cry. Instead, he felt purposeful. These animals needed him, depended on him for their survival. It was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but one he found himself embracing wholeheartedly. As he gently stroked Maya's head, Daniel's thoughts drifted to Emily. What would she think of this sudden turn of events? He could almost hear her laugh, see the sparkle in her eyes as she teased him about becoming a dog rescuer. The memory, for once, didn't bring the usual stabbing pain. Instead, it filled him with a bittersweet warmth. "I miss you, Em," he whispered into the quiet room. "I wish you were here to see this. You always wanted a dog." A single tear rolled down his cheek, but it wasn't accompanied by the usual flood of despair. Instead, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. As he drifted off to sleep, his back against the couch and a puppy snoring softly on his chest, Daniel realized something. The act of saving these dogs, of caring for something outside of himself, had given him a tiny spark of hope. It wasn't much, just a flicker in the vast darkness that had consumed him for so long, but it was there. For the first time in over a year, Daniel fell asleep without the aid of sleeping pills or alcohol. His dreams, usually plagued by nightmares of screeching tires and shattering glass, were instead filled with images of playful puppies and Emily's smiling face. And as the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, Daniel stirred, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to get up and face the day. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, but as he looked at the sleeping dogs beside him, Daniel felt a glimmer of something he had thought lost forever: hope. With this small family of dogs depending on him, he had found a purpose, a reason to keep going. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step towards healing his shattered soul. The morning sun streamed through the living room windows, casting a warm glow on Daniel's face as he stirred from his slumber. For a moment, he was disoriented, wondering why he was on the floor instead of in his bed. Then he felt a soft weight on his chest and remembered the dogs he had rescued from the river. Daniel sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the puppy still sleeping on him. Maya, the mother Labrador, was already awake, her gentle brown eyes watching him intently. As he met her gaze, Daniel felt a surge of determination. These dogs needed help, and he was going to make sure they got it. With a newfound sense of purpose, Daniel went through his morning routine for the first time in months without feeling like he was moving through molasses. He even managed to eat a proper breakfast, a bowl of Cheerios and a banana, instead of just coffee. As he ate, he couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of the puppies tumbling over each other, exploring their new surroundings with clumsy enthusiasm. Once he was ready, Daniel gathered the dogs into his old Subaru Outback. It was a car he and Emily had bought together, planning to use it for weekend camping trips and eventually for carting around kids and sports equipment. The memory of those plans no longer felt like a knife to the heart. Instead, it brought a bittersweet smile to his face as he helped Maya and her puppies into the backseat. The drive to Millbrook Veterinary Clinic was short, the streets of the small town quiet on a Monday morning. As Daniel pulled into the parking lot, he saw Dr. Sarah Thompson unlocking the front door. He had known Sarah for years. She had been Emily's best friend since college, and it was partly because of her that they had chosen to move to Millbrook. "Danny." Sarah's voice was filled with surprise as she saw him get out of the car. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" Daniel managed a small smile, the action feeling foreign on his face after so long. "Hey, Sarah. I need your help with something." As he opened the back door of the car, Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "Oh my God, Danny. Where did you find them?" Daniel quickly explained the events of the previous day as they carefully transferred Maya and her puppies into the clinic. Sarah's face grew serious as she examined the rope marks on Maya's neck. "This was deliberate," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Someone tied her up and threw her in the river. If you hadn't found her." She trailed off, shaking her head. As Sarah began her examination, Daniel felt a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. Anger at whoever had done this to Maya, worry for the dog's health, and underneath it all, a strange sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "Well, aside from some rope burns and mild hypothermia, they're in surprisingly good shape," Sarah announced after a thorough checkup. "The puppies are about 3 weeks old, and Mom here is doing a great job taking care of them." Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "That's good news. So, what happens now?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. "Well, normally in cases like this, we'd contact animal control and they'd take over. But..." She paused, studying Daniel's face. "You seem pretty attached to them already." Daniel nodded, surprising himself with the intensity of his feelings. "Yeah, I guess I am. Is there any way I could keep them? At least until we figure out where they came from?" A smile spread across Sarah's face, the first real one Daniel had seen from her in months. "I think that could be arranged. But first, let's see if we can find out who they belong to." As Sarah scanned Maya for a microchip, Daniel found himself hoping they wouldn't find anything. The thought of giving up these dogs, who had already brought a spark of life back into his world, made his chest tighten. Suddenly, Sarah's scanner beeped. "We've got a hit," she said, her brow furrowing as she read the information. "The dog's name is Maya, looks like you guessed right on that one, Danny. And her owner is Margaret Bowen." Daniel's heart sank. He knew he should be happy that they had found Maya's owner, but the thought of saying goodbye to her and the puppies was unexpectedly painful. Sarah, noticing his expression, quickly added, "But don't worry, we can't just hand them over without making sure everything's okay. Let me make a few calls." As Sarah stepped out to use the phone, Daniel sat on the floor next to the examination table where Maya and her puppies were resting. Maya nuzzled his hand, and he felt a lump form in his throat. "It's okay, girl," he murmured. "We'll figure this out." A few minutes later, Sarah returned, her face grave. "Danny, there's something you need to know. Margaret Bowen is in the hospital. She's been in a coma for the past month due to a severe car accident." The news hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Another car accident, another life changed forever. He couldn't help but draw parallels to his own loss, and a wave of empathy washed over him for this woman he had never met. "What about her family?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah shook her head. "That's where it gets complicated. Her brother, Richard, has been managing her affairs since the accident. But there have been rumors." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What kind of rumors?" Sarah lowered her voice, even though they were alone in the examination room. "Nothing concrete, but people have been talking. Richard's never been the most upstanding citizen, and there are whispers that he's been more interested in Margaret's estate than her well-being." A cold feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. "You don't think he couldn't have been the one who—" Sarah nodded grimly. "It's possible. If Margaret wakes up, Maya could complicate things for him. But we can't prove anything." Daniel stood up, a determination he hadn't felt in months coursing through him. "We need to find out more. These dogs need protection, and if Richard is behind this, he needs to be stopped." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Danny, are you sure you want to get involved in this?" It could be dangerous. Daniel glanced down at Maya, who was looking up at him with trust in her eyes. He thought about how close she and her puppies had come to dying, about Margaret lying unconscious in a hospital bed, unaware that her beloved pet had nearly been killed. For the first time in a long time, he felt a fire ignite within him. A desire to fight for something, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I can't just stand by and do nothing. Not again." Sarah squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Okay, then. Where do we start?" Over the next few days, Daniel threw himself into investigating Margaret's situation with an energy he hadn't possessed since Emily's death. He and Sarah pored over public records, talked to neighbors, and even managed to get some information from a sympathetic nurse at the hospital where Margaret was staying. What they uncovered was disturbing. Richard Bowen had a history of financial troubles and had been in and out of legal scrapes for years. Since taking over Margaret's affairs, he had been making moves to sell off parts of her estate, including her beloved farmhouse on the outskirts of town. "He can't do that, can he?" Daniel asked Sarah as they sat in his living room, surrounded by papers and laptop screens. Maya lay at their feet, her puppies snuggled against her. Sarah shook her head. "Not legally, no. But if Margaret doesn't wake up soon, he might try to declare her incompetent and take full control of her assets." The thought made Daniel's blood boil. He looked down at Maya, remembering how close she had come to drowning in that river. "We can't let that happen," he said firmly. As they continued their investigation, Daniel found himself growing more and more invested in Margaret's story. Through conversations with her neighbors and friends, he built a picture of a kind, generous woman who loved animals and had a passion for gardening. Her farmhouse, which Richard was so eager to sell, had been in her family for generations. One evening, as Daniel was walking Maya along the river where he had found her, he made a decision. He couldn't sit back and watch as Richard potentially destroyed Margaret's life. He needed to do something more. With Sarah's help, Daniel got in touch with Officer Jane Collins, a local police detective known for her integrity and determination. When they presented their suspicions and the evidence they had gathered, Jane listened intently, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "This is serious," she said when they had finished. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at attempted animal cruelty at the very least, and possibly much more severe crimes." Daniel leaned forward, his voice intense. "What can we do?" Jane thought for a moment. "We need more concrete evidence to move forward with any charges. But," she added, seeing the disappointment on Daniel's face, "that doesn't mean we can't start building a case. I have some contacts who might be able to help us dig deeper into Richard's activities." As they left the police station, Sarah turned to Daniel, a mix of concern and admiration on her face. "Danny, are you sure about this? Getting involved in a criminal investigation, it's a big step." Daniel paused, thinking about how his life had changed in just a few short weeks. From the depths of despair, he had found a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. He thought about Maya and her puppies, about Margaret lying unconscious in the hospital, about the life he had lost with Emily. "I'm sure," he said quietly. "For the first time since Emily died, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can help save Margaret and her dogs." Sarah squeezed his hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "Emily would be proud of you, you know." As they walked back to the car, Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The pain of losing Emily would never fully go away, but in helping Maya and fighting for Margaret, he had found a way to honor her memory. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. With Maya trotting beside him and the sun setting over Millbrook, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. The mystery was far from solved, and the road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer alone. With Sarah, Jane, and the dogs by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. A future where justice could be served, and where healing was possible, even in the face of tremendous loss. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Daniel pulled his Subaru into a parking spot in front of Millbrook Diner. He yawned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. It had been a late night, poring over documents with Sarah and Officer Collins, trying to piece together the puzzle of Richard Bowen's activities. As he pushed open the diner's door, The cheerful jingle of bells announced his arrival. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, making his stomach growl. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. "Morning, Danny," called out Marge, the diner's owner and chief gossip hub of Millbrook. "The usual." Daniel managed a tired smile. "Thanks, Marge. And maybe some extra bacon today?" He slid into his usual booth by the window, his mind racing with everything they had uncovered. Richard's financial records were a mess of suspicious transactions and unexplained cash withdrawals. But it wasn't enough to prove he had anything to do with Maya's attempted drowning, let alone any plans against Margaret. As he waited for his food, Daniel's gaze wandered around the diner. It was mostly empty at this early hour, just a few regulars nursing their coffee. But then, a familiar face caught his eye, making his blood run cold. Richard Bowen had just walked in, looking nervous and fidgety. He glanced around before sliding into a booth in the far corner. A few minutes later, a man Daniel didn't recognize joined him. They began talking in hushed tones, their heads close together. Daniel's heart raced. This could be the break they needed. Trying to appear casual, he pulled out his phone and pretended to be engrossed in it while straining to hear their conversation. "Can't wait much longer," Richard was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "If Margaret wakes up..." The other man cut him off. "She won't. Trust me. But we need to tie up loose ends. Those dogs." Daniel's grip on his phone tightened. They were talking about Maya and her puppies. He forced himself to stay calm, not wanting to draw attention to himself. Richard's voice came again, even lower this time. "I thought I'd taken care of that. How did they survive?" "Doesn't matter," the other man growled. "We need to finish the job. Tonight." The farmhouse. Just then, Marge appeared with Daniel's breakfast, the clatter of plates drowning out the rest of the conversation. Daniel thanked her distractedly, his mind reeling from what he'd overheard. As soon as Marge walked away, Daniel texted Sarah and Officer Collins, "Emergency. Meet at the clinic ASAP." He forced himself to eat a few bites of his breakfast, not wanting to arouse suspicion. Richard and his companion finished their conversation and left separately, neither sparing a glance in Daniel's direction. Once they were gone, Daniel quickly paid his bill and rushed out. His hands shook as he started his car. They had been right all along. Richard was planning something sinister, and Maya and her puppies were still in danger. At the clinic, Sarah and Officer Collins were waiting for him, concern etched on their faces. Daniel quickly recounted what he had overheard at the diner. "This is serious," Officer Collins said, her brow furrowed. "If they're planning something for tonight, we need to act fast. But we can't move without concrete evidence." Sarah spoke up, her voice filled with worry. "What about Maya and the puppies? If they're still in danger, we need to move them," Daniel said firmly. "Somewhere safe, where Richard won't think to look." Officer Collins nodded. "I have an idea. My sister runs a small animal sanctuary just outside of town. It's secluded, and she's used to handling sensitive cases. We can move the dogs there temporarily." As they made arrangements to transport Maya and her puppies, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The mention of the farmhouse kept playing in his mind. What were Richard and his accomplice planning to do there? Later that afternoon, with the dogs safely hidden at the sanctuary, Daniel, Sarah, and Officer Collins gathered at the police station to plan their next move. "We need eyes on that farmhouse," Officer Collins said, spreading out a map of Millbrook on her desk. "If Richard's planning something there tonight, we need to catch him in the act." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I'll do it. I can stake out the place, keep watch." Sarah looked at him worriedly. "Danny, are you sure? It could be dangerous." He met her gaze, determination written across his face. "I'm sure. I started this, and I want to see it through." Officer Collins nodded approvingly. "All right, but you're not going in alone. I'll have a team on standby, ready to move in at a moment's notice. You'll be our eyes and ears, nothing more." "Understood." Daniel agreed, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. As they went over the details of the plan, he couldn't help but think about how much his life had changed in just a few short weeks. From the depths of despair, he had found a purpose, a reason to keep going. And now, he was about to play a key role in uncovering a sinister plot. As the sun began to set, Daniel found himself parked on a small dirt road with a clear view of Margaret's farmhouse. The old Victorian structure stood silently against the darkening sky, its windows dark and empty. He checked his watch, 8:30 p.m. The waiting game had begun. Hours ticked by slowly. Daniel sipped on cold coffee, his eyes never leaving the farmhouse. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car engine made him tense up. But nothing happened. It was close to midnight when he saw the first sign of movement. A car with its headlights off crept up the long driveway to the farmhouse. Daniel's heart raced as he recognized Richard stepping out of the driver's side. The man from the diner emerged from the passenger seat. With shaking hands, Daniel sent a text to Officer Collins. "They're here. 2 of them. Moving towards the house." The response came back immediately, "Stay put. We're on our way." Daniel watched as Richard and his accomplice made their way to the back of the house, disappearing from view. He fought the urge to get closer, reminding himself of his promise to Officer Collins. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared in one of the upstairs windows. Daniel squinted, trying to make out what was happening. Then, to his horror, he saw smoke beginning to billow out. They were setting the house on fire. Without thinking, Daniel leaped out of his car and sprinted towards the farmhouse. He knew he was breaking protocol, but he couldn't just sit and watch as Margaret's family home went up in flames. As he reached the back of the house, he saw Richard and his accomplice hurrying away. They spotted him at the same moment. "Hey!" Daniel shouted. "Stop right there." The accomplice started to run, but Richard, in a moment of panic or bravado, charged at Daniel. They collided, tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Daniel found himself wrestling with Richard, the smell of smoke growing stronger by the second. In the distance, he could hear sirens approaching. "Why?" Daniel grunted as they struggled. "Why would you do this to your own sister?" Richard's face was contorted with rage and fear. "You don't understand. I had no choice. The debts, they were going to kill me if I didn't pay up." Just then, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Officer Collins and her team had arrived. In moments, they had Richard and his accomplice in handcuffs. As the fire department worked to contain the blaze, Daniel sat on the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over his shoulders. Officer Collins approached him, her face a mix of frustration and admiration. "That was a reckless thing you did," she said sternly. "But, you probably saved the house. And you definitely gave us the evidence we needed. Good work, Daniel." Daniel nodded, still processing everything that had happened. As he watched Richard being led away in a police car, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and an unexpected sense of closure. Sarah appeared by his side, wrapping him in a tight hug. "Danny, you scared me half to death. Are you okay?" He hugged her back, realizing how much he had missed this kind of human connection. "Yeah, I'm okay. It's over now." As the night wore on and statements were taken, the full picture of Richard's plot came to light. Drowning in gambling debts, he had made a desperate plan to sell off Margaret's assets, including burning down the farmhouse for insurance money. Maya and her puppies had been collateral damage, a loose end he had tried to tie up. In the early hours of the morning, as Daniel finally headed home, exhausted but triumphant, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: a sense of accomplishment, of having made a real difference. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw a figure sitting on his porch steps. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized Dr. Thompson from the hospital where Margaret was being treated. "Dr. Thompson," he called out as he got out of the car. "Is everything okay?" The doctor stood up, a smile breaking across his tired face. "Mr. Harris, I've been trying to reach you. It's about Margaret Bowen. She's awake." Daniel stood there, stunned. After everything that had happened, this felt like a miracle. Tears pricked at his eyes as he thought about Maya, safe at the animal sanctuary, waiting to be reunited with her owner. As the sun began to rise over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served. And somewhere in the process, he had found his way back to life. With a smile, He invited Dr. Thompson inside. There was a lot to talk about, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel was looking forward to the conversation. As he opened his front door, he felt like he was opening a new chapter in his life, one filled with hope, purpose, and the promise of healing. The soft beeping of hospital machinery filled the air as Daniel stood in the doorway of Margaret Bowen's room. His heart raced with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. After weeks of fighting for her and her dogs, he was finally going to meet the woman at the center of it all. Margaret lay propped up in bed, her face pale but alert. Her eyes lit up as Dr. Thompson introduced Daniel. "This is the young man I was telling you about, Margaret. The one who saved Maya and her puppies." Daniel stepped forward, a lump forming in his throat. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Bowen. I'm glad you're awake." Margaret's voice was weak but warm. "Please, call me Margaret. And thank you, Daniel. Dr. Thompson told me everything you've done. I don't know how I can ever repay you." As Daniel pulled up a chair beside her bed, the story spilled out. He told her about finding Maya in the river, about the investigation into Richard's activities, and about the night at the farmhouse. Margaret listened intently, her eyes filling with tears. "I can't believe Richard would do something like this," she said softly when Daniel finished. "My own brother." Daniel reached out and gently patted her hand. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this. But it's over now. Richard and his accomplice are in custody, and your property is safe." Margaret managed a small smile. "And Maya? The puppies? Are they really okay?" Daniel nodded, pulling out his phone to show her some pictures. "They're doing great. They've been staying at a local animal sanctuary, but they're ready to come home whenever you're up for it." As Margaret gazed at the photos, tears streaming down her face, Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was why he had fought so hard, why he had pushed through his own grief and pain. To see the joy on Margaret's face, to know that he had made a difference, it made everything worth it. Over the next few weeks, as Margaret regained her strength, Daniel found himself visiting the hospital regularly. They talked about Maya and the puppies, about Margaret's life before the accident, and about Daniel's own journey through grief. There was something cathartic about sharing his story with someone who understood loss so intimately. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in the hospital garden, Margaret turned to Daniel with a serious expression. "Daniel, I want to thank you properly for everything you've done. Not just for Maya and me, but for bringing Richard to justice." Daniel shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Margaret. I'm just glad I could help." But Margaret persisted. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do when I get out of here. The idea of going back to that big, empty farmhouse, it's daunting. But I've always loved animals, and what you did for Maya, it's inspired me." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to turn the farmhouse into an animal sanctuary. A place where abused and abandoned animals can heal and find new homes. And I want you to help me run it." Daniel sat there, stunned. Of all the things he had expected Margaret to say, this wasn't one of them. "Margaret, I don't know what to say. Are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything. You have a gift, Daniel. The way you connected with Maya, how you fought for her, that's special. Will you at least think about it?" As Daniel left the hospital that day, his mind was reeling. Margaret's offer was unexpected, but the more he thought about it, the more right it felt. Working with animals had brought him out of the darkest period of his life. Maybe this was a chance to pay that forward. Meanwhile, the wheels of justice were turning. Richard and his accomplice were facing multiple charges, including attempted animal cruelty, insurance fraud, and arson. The evidence against them was overwhelming, thanks in large part to Daniel's efforts. The day of Richard's arraignment arrived, and Daniel found himself sitting in the courthouse, his stomach in knots. Officer Collins sat beside him, her presence a comforting reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. As Richard was led into the courtroom, Daniel was struck by how small and defeated he looked. Gone was the arrogant, scheming man he had wrestled with at the farmhouse. In his place was a broken figure, the weight of his crimes visible in the slump of his shoulders. The proceedings moved quickly. Richard, advised by his lawyer, pleaded guilty to all charges. As the judge read out the list of crimes, Daniel felt a mix of emotions wash over him: relief that justice was being served, sadness for Margaret and the betrayal she had suffered, and a strange sense of closure for his own journey. When it was time for victim statements, Daniel was surprised to hear his name called. He hadn't prepared anything, but as he stood before the court, the words came naturally. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "a few months ago, I was lost in grief, barely able to get through each day. Then I found a dog and her puppies, struggling for life in a river. In saving them, I found a purpose. In fighting for them, I found a way to honor the memory of my wife, who I had lost to a car accident." He paused, gathering his thoughts. What Mr. Bowen did was inexcusable. He not only betrayed his sister's trust but also showed a callous disregard for innocent lives. But in doing so, he inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that brought healing to many. The animals he tried to dispose of are now safe and loved. His sister, despite his actions, is recovering and planning a new chapter in her life dedicated to helping other animals in need. Daniel looked directly at Richard, who couldn't meet his gaze. "I stand here today not to condemn Mr. Bowen, but to ask that whatever sentence he receives includes mandatory counseling and community service, preferably working with animals. Perhaps in facing the consequences of his actions and experiencing the unconditional love that animals offer, he too can find a path to redemption." As Daniel returned to his seat, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had said his piece, not just for Maya and Margaret, but for himself as well. The judge's sentence came swiftly: 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7, mandatory counseling, and 1,000 hours of community service at an animal shelter upon release. As Richard was led away, Daniel caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a flicker of remorse, perhaps even gratitude. Outside the courthouse, Daniel found himself surrounded by reporters, all clamoring for a statement. He was about to brush them off when he saw Sarah and Officer Collins nodding encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, he faced the cameras. "Today, justice was served," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. But this case was never just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about protecting the vulnerable, both human and animal. It was about community coming together to right a wrong. And most importantly, it was about hope. Hope that even in our darkest moments, we can find purpose and healing. As the reporters pressed for more details, Daniel felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Margaret, looking frail but determined, leaning on a cane. "Mind if I join you?" she asked with a smile. Together, they faced the cameras, telling the story of Maya's rescue, the investigation, and their plans for the animal sanctuary. As they spoke, Daniel felt a surge of pride and purpose. This wasn't just the end of a difficult chapter, it was the beginning of a new one, filled with promise and possibility. Later that evening, as Daniel sat on his porch with Maya at his feet and one of her puppies in his lap, he reflected on the whirlwind of the past few months. From the depths of despair, he had found his way back to life. He had made new friends, brought a criminal to justice, and found a new purpose. As the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Daniel felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew there would still be difficult days ahead, moments when the grief would threaten to overwhelm him. But now he had something he hadn't had before: hope. With a smile, he scratched behind Maya's ears. "What do you say, girl? Ready for a new adventure?" Maya looked up at him, her brown eyes full of trust and affection. In that moment, Daniel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. With Maya, Margaret, and his newfound family by his side, he was ready to embrace this new chapter of his life. One filled with compassion, purpose, and the healing power of love. The crisp autumn air nipped at Daniel's cheeks as he stood on the porch of Margaret's farmhouse, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. It had been 6 months since the trial, and the world around him had transformed just as dramatically as his life had. The once neglected Victorian farmhouse now bustled with activity. The peeling paint had been refreshed, the creaky boards replaced, and the overgrown garden tamed into a welcoming space for both humans and animals. The sound of barking dogs and the occasional bleat of a rescued goat filled the air, a cacophony that never failed to bring a smile to Daniel's face. "Penny for your thoughts." Margaret's voice broke through his reverie. She joined him on the porch, her own mug in hand, looking healthier and happier than he had ever seen her. Daniel grinned. Just thinking about how much has changed. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be running an animal sanctuary, I would have thought they were crazy. Margaret chuckled, a warm sound that had become familiar and comforting to Daniel over the past months. Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? Speaking of surprises, did Sarah call you about the fundraiser? Daniel nodded, excitement bubbling up inside him. Yeah, she did. I still can't believe how much support we're getting from the community. Who would have thought Millbrook had so many animal lovers? The fundraiser had been Sarah's idea. As news of Margaret and Daniel's plans for the sanctuary spread, the town had rallied around them. What started as a small event at the local community center had grown into a full-blown festival, with local businesses sponsoring booths, live music, and even a silent auction. We should head into town soon, Margaret said, glancing at her watch. We promised Sarah we'd help set up. As they drove into Millbrook, Daniel couldn't help but marvel at how different everything looked through his new lens on life. The same streets he had once trudged through in a fog of grief now seemed vibrant and full of possibility. He recognized faces, waved at neighbors, felt a part of something bigger than himself. Main Street had been transformed for the fundraiser. Colorful banners hung between lampposts, proclaiming Millbrook loves animals and supports Second Chance's sanctuary. The name they had chosen for their new venture still gave Daniel a thrill every time he saw it. Sarah was waiting for them outside the community center, clipboard in hand and a harried expression on her face. Thank goodness you're here, she said as they approached. We're short on volunteers for the face painting booth. Daniel, how are your artistic skills? Before he could protest, Daniel found himself stationed at a small table, surrounded by giggling children and armed with a palette of face paints. As he carefully painted whiskers and noses, transforming excited kids into cats, dogs, and even the occasional unicorn, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was what it meant to be part of a community, to contribute to something joyful and meaningful. The day flew by in a blur of activity. Daniel manned booths, answered questions about the sanctuary, and even found himself on stage at one point, sharing the story of how he found Maya and her puppies. As he spoke, he caught sight of Officer Collins in the crowd, giving him a thumbs up. Her support throughout this journey had been invaluable, and he made a mental note to thank her properly later. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festival, Daniel found a quiet moment to slip away. He wandered to the edge of the town square, where a small memorial garden had been planted. In the center stood a simple stone bench, engraved with the names of Millbrook residents who had passed away. Daniel's fingers traced the familiar letters of Emily's name. Wish you could see this, Em, he whispered. I think you'd be proud. A gentle hand on his shoulder made him turn. Margaret stood there, her eyes understanding. She is proud, Daniel. I'm sure of it. They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, honoring the memory of those they had lost. Then, with a deep breath, Daniel straightened up. Ready to go back to the chaos, he asked with a smile. As they rejoined the festival, Daniel was struck by a realization. The pain of losing Emily would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had found a way to honor her memory by living fully, by helping others, by opening his heart to new connections and experiences. The final event of the day was the silent auction. Daniel watched in amazement as bids rolled in for everything from local artwork to weekend getaways. But the item that caught his eye was a beautiful handmade quilt, each square depicting a different animal they had rescued at the sanctuary. As the auction closed and winners were announced, Daniel was surprised to hear his name called. He hadn't placed any bids, conscious of his limited budget. Confused, he made his way to the front. This is for you, Sarah said, handing him the quilt with a mischievous smile. The whole town pitched in to buy it for you. It's our way of saying thank you for everything you've done. Overwhelmed, Daniel clutched the quilt to his chest, feeling the softness of the fabric and the weight of the community's appreciation. He looked out at the sea of familiar faces, all smiling back at him, and felt a lump form in his throat. I don't know what to say, he managed, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you all so much. But I'm not the one you should be thanking. This sanctuary, this community, it saved me as much as I helped save any animal. You all gave me a second chance at life, and I'll never be able to express how grateful I am for that." A chorus of cheers and applause erupted, and Daniel found himself enveloped in a group hug, with Margaret, Sarah, and Officer Collins at its center. As he stood there, surrounded by warmth and love, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced since Emily's death. Later that night, as Daniel and Margaret sat on the farmhouse porch, exhausted but content, they marveled at the success of the day. "We raised enough to build that new barn," Margaret said, her voice filled with excitement. "And did you see how many people signed up to volunteer?" Daniel nodded, still somewhat in awe of how things had turned out. "It's amazing. A year ago, I couldn't even imagine a future for myself. And now you're changing lives," Margaret finished for him. "Both animal and human." As if on cue, Maya trotted up to them, her tail wagging. She rested her head on Daniel's knee, looking up at him with those soulful brown eyes that had first captured his heart on that fateful day by the river. Daniel scratched behind her ears, feeling a profound sense of peace. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think saving Maya was the beginning of this journey. But really, she saved me." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "You saved each other. And in doing so, you've created something beautiful here. Something that will help countless others find their own second chances." As the stars began to twinkle in the clear night sky, Daniel allowed himself to truly believe in the future stretching out before him. It wasn't the future he had once planned with Emily, but it was rich with purpose, love, and the promise of more lives touched and transformed. He thought about the quilt, now draped over the back of his favorite chair inside. Each square represented an animal they had saved, but to Daniel, it represented so much more. It was a tapestry of his new life, each thread a connection, each color a different facet of the joy and purpose he had found. With Maya at his feet and the gentle sounds of the sanctuary animals in the background, Daniel took a deep breath of the cool night air. He felt grateful, not just for the second chance he had been given, but for the opportunity to pay it forward, to be a part of giving second chances to others. As he and Margaret continued to chat softly, planning for the sanctuary's future and sharing stories of the day's events, Daniel felt a sense of contentment wash over him. He had found his place in the world, a purpose that honored Emily's memory while allowing him to grow and heal. The path ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but Daniel felt ready to face them. With the support of his newfound family, Margaret, Sarah, Officer Collins, the animals, and the entire Millbrook community, he knew he could weather any storm. As the night deepened and Margaret bid him goodnight, Daniel lingered on the porch for a moment longer. He looked out over the sanctuary grounds, barely visible in the moonlight, and felt a surge of excitement for what the future held. "Here's to new beginnings," he whispered to the night, raising his mug in a silent toast. Maya wagged her tail in agreement, and together, they headed inside, ready to rest and recharge for another day of second chances. The morning sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold as Daniel stood at the entrance of Second Chance's sanctuary. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees lining the driveway, carrying with it the promise of a beautiful spring day. It was hard to believe that a year had passed since the sanctuary's grand opening. Daniel took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp morning air tinged with the familiar scents of hay and animal feed. The sound of roosters crowing in the distance brought a smile to his face. It was a far cry from the silence that had once enveloped him in the depths of his grief. "Nervous?" Margaret's voice came from behind him. She joined him at the entrance, her eyes twinkling with excitement. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe a little. It's not every day we celebrate our first anniversary and host a major adoption event. Today was more than just the sanctuary's anniversary. It marked the culmination of a year's worth of hard work, dedication, and love. They were hosting their largest adoption event yet, with families from all over the state coming to meet the animals and potentially give them forever homes. As they walked back towards the main barn, Daniel marveled at how much the sanctuary had grown. What had started as a handful of rescued animals in Margaret's old farmhouse had blossomed into a full-fledged operation. The property now boasted several new barns, a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, and even a small education center where they hosted school groups and community workshops. Sarah met them at the barn, clipboard in hand and a harried expression on her face. "There you two are. We've got a million things to do before the gates open." Daniel couldn't help but grin at Sarah's enthusiasm. Her role as the sanctuary's volunteer coordinator had brought out a side of her he'd never seen before, organized, passionate, and fiercely dedicated to the animals. As they went through final preparations, checking on animals, setting up adoption stations, and briefing volunteers, Daniel felt a swell of pride. Each face he saw, from the eager high school students who came to volunteer every weekend to the retired veterinarian who offered his services pro bono, represented a connection forged, a life touched by the sanctuary's mission. At precisely 10 a.m., Officer Collins, now a dear friend and staunch supporter of the sanctuary, opened the gates. A steady stream of cars began to pour in, filled with families excited to meet the animals and learn about the sanctuary's work. Daniel found himself at the dog enclosure, introducing potential adopters to the various canine residents. As he knelt down to comfort a shy terrier mix, he caught sight of a familiar face, Maya, now the sanctuary's unofficial mascot, playing with a group of children in the nearby field. "She's come a long way, hasn't she?" a voice said beside him. Daniel looked up to see Dr. Thompson, the veterinarian who had cared for Maya and her puppies in those early days. Daniel nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "We both have. Document. We both have." As the day progressed, Daniel moved from station to station, sharing stories of rescue and rehabilitation, offering advice to potential adopters, and occasionally wiping away a tear as he watched animals he'd grown to love find their forever homes. One moment stood out in particular. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, had been sitting quietly by the cat enclosure for over an hour. Daniel had noticed her earlier, her eyes fixed on a 3-legged tabby cat named Tripod who had been at the sanctuary for months. Curious, Daniel approached her. "Hi there," he said gently. "I see you've made a friend." The girl nodded, not taking her eyes off Tripod. "Nobody wants him because he's different," she said softly. "But I think he's perfect." Daniel felt his heart swell. He knelt down beside her, watching as Tripod hobbled over to the edge of the enclosure, purring loudly. "You know," Daniel said, "I think Tripod agrees with you." A few hours later, Daniel watched with misty eyes as the girl and her parents filled out adoption papers for Tripod. The joy on the girl's face as she cradled the cat in her arms was a poignant reminder of why they had started this sanctuary in the first place. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel found a quiet moment to slip away. He made his way to a small hilltop overlooking the sanctuary grounds. It was a spot he often came to when he needed a moment of reflection. From this vantage point, he could see the entire property: the barns, the pastures, the small pond where rescued ducks paddled happily. He could see families laughing, children running with dogs, volunteers leading tours. It was a scene of joy, of healing, of second chances. Daniel's thoughts drifted to Emily. He could almost hear her laughter on the breeze, could almost see her beaming with pride at what he had accomplished. The pain of her loss would always be a part of him, but it no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it had become a driving force, pushing him to create something beautiful in her memory. "I thought I might find you up here," Margaret's voice broke through his reverie. She joined him on the hilltop, her eyes taking in the scene below. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Margaret seemed to understand, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You know," she said after a moment, "when I first suggested turning the farmhouse into a sanctuary, I never imagined it would become this. You've built something truly special here, Daniel." Daniel shook his head, turning to face her. "We built this, Margaret. All of us. You, me, Sarah, Officer Collins, every volunteer, every adopter, every animal. It's been a team effort from the start." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Emily would be so proud of you, Daniel. So proud of what you've created in her name." At the mention of Emily's name, Daniel felt a familiar pang in his chest. But for the first time, it wasn't accompanied by crushing grief. Instead, he felt a warm sense of gratitude, for the love he had shared with Emily, for the journey that had brought him here, for the family he had found in Margaret and the others. As they made their way back down to the festivities, Daniel's mind wandered to the future. There was still so much to do, so many animals to save, so many lives to touch. The sanctuary was more than just a place for animals to heal, it had become a beacon of hope for the entire community. The rest of the day passed in a blur of wagging tails, purring cats, and joyful families. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the sanctuary, Daniel stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, watching as the last of the visitors drove away. Sarah joined him, a tired but happy smile on her face. 37 adoptions, she announced proudly. That's a new record for us. Daniel felt a surge of joy at the news. 37 animals who now had loving homes, 37 families whose lives had been enriched by the love of a pet. It was more than he could have ever hoped for. As the sanctuary staff and volunteers gathered for a celebratory dinner, Daniel looked around the table at the faces of those who had become his family. Margaret, her eyes twinkling as she recounted a funny story from the day. Sarah, animatedly discussing plans for their next event. Officer Collins, who had become one of their staunchest allies in the fight against animal cruelty. In that moment, surrounded by laughter and love, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of overwhelming grief. But through it all, he had persevered. And in doing so, he had found healing not just for himself, but for countless others, both human and animal. As the night wore on and stars began to twinkle in the sky, Daniel stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. Maya, ever faithful, followed him out. Together, they walked to the edge of the property, where a small memorial garden had been planted in Emily's honor. Daniel knelt down, running his fingers over the smooth stone bearing Emily's name. "We did it, Em," he whispered. "We created something beautiful." Maya nuzzled his hand, her warm presence a comfort as always. Daniel scratched behind her ears, marveling at how this one dog, rescued from a river on a cold winter's day, had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed so many lives. As he stood up, Daniel's gaze swept over the sanctuary grounds. In the moonlight, he could make out the silhouettes of the barns, the fences, the trees. Each element represented a story of rescue, of healing, of hope. The sanctuary had become more than just a place for animals to find refuge. It had become a community, a family, a home. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the healing power of compassion, and to the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. As Daniel walked back to the farmhouse, Maya trotting contentedly by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There would be more animals to save, more lives to touch, more hope to spread. But as he rejoined the others, their laughter and warmth enveloping him like a blanket, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with an open heart and a grateful spirit. For in creating this sanctuary of hope, he had found his own sanctuary, a place of healing, of purpose, and of unconditional love. The story of Second Chance's sanctuary was far from over. But with each passing day, with each life touched and transformed, it was writing itself, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of community, and the enduring spirit of hope that resides in us all.